After 7 decades of analyzing companies, I've come to one fundamental conclusion. An organization's true character is revealed by its actions in the absence of scrutiny. That is the ultimate test of integrity. It's quite straightforward, isn't it? Would you be comfortable with every single one of your decisions being published on the front page of your local paper for your friends and family to see? If you hesitate, well, you likely shouldn't be making that decision. Why do I begin with that? Because our nation is currently undergoing that exact test in public, and the early returns are deeply concerning. When you see a third formal warning from the same entity in a single period, you're not hearing static. You're receiving a clear signal. In my line of work, signals are far more valuable than headlines. So, I want to explain the current situation. Because whether you are deeply engaged in politics or actively try to ignore it, this impacts you. It impacts your nation and the very institutions you rely on. Here's a free piece of information. A Democratic Congresswoman has just filed new articles of impeachment against President Donald Trump. This is the third time. This has parallels to events during his previous term, but this isn't a repeat. We are not revisiting old charges. There's no mention of Ukraine or January 6th. These are fresh claims stemming from recent conduct that raise entirely new constitutional alarms. From an investor's standpoint, this is significant, not for the politics but for what it indicates about institutional credibility. You see, structural fragility doesn't always announce itself with a crash. It often begins as a series of quiet patterns that are overlooked for too long. Small fissures, minor compromises, actions that seem insignificant until they collectively threaten the entire foundation. Allow me to explain the details, because they are crucial. Tanador's position is direct. She alleges a pattern of repeated actions by Trump that erode the Constitution and the very function of governance. Unauthorized removals, damaging trade policies, and the erosion of key federal bodies. In the financial world, when leadership warps the regulations meant to ensure transparency, investors don't just recalculate earnings, they reprice the long-term risk of the nation itself. And make no mistake, unconstrained authority is not streamlined. It is incredibly costly. We are observing the mounting price of institutional weakness, and that is a risk that markets cannot effectively hedge. Now, given the Republican majority in the House, the probability of immediate success for this Democratic-led push is low. Conviction requires a substantial bipartisan consensus. However, the function of impeachment isn't always removal. Often, its purpose is to create a permanent historical record. A third formal attempt is a profound constitutional anomaly. If it advances, it changes the risk calculation for all future executives. If it is dismissed, it risks normalizing a very hazardous precedent. Regardless of the outcome, the enduring effects on trust, the rule of law, and civic integrity are the metrics we should be focused on. In any system, credibility compounds like interest. Once it is eroded, it almost never returns at its original value. The developments of the last 48 hours are especially indicative. The conversation in Washington has pivoted from hypothetical scenarios to a structural crisis. New impeachment articles were just filed. This is not political drama. It is an inflection point. From a risk management perspective, the real worry is the convergence of threats. We have a formal legislative process on one hand and, simultaneously, quiet discussions of executive removal by Trump's own cabinet on the other. That kind of parallel pressure signifies a deep institutional break. In business terms, it's like a board of directors, simultaneously facing a derivative lawsuit and deliberating the ouster of their CEO. That scenario only occurs when the core enterprise is under existential threat. Here is where the plot thickens. Reports from administrative insiders suggest that senior officials are privately debating the use of the 25th Amendment. Let's be clear on what this is. The 25th Amendment provides a mechanism for transferring presidential authority if the incumbent is judged incapable of executing their responsibilities. It was designed for continuity, not politics, a tool for moments when the nation's leadership must be preserved during a crisis. And these discussions are not happening among junior staff. This is cabinet-level deliberation. I have watched leadership changes in boardrooms for more than half a century. I can assure you of this. When an inner circle starts drafting plans for an involuntary removal, the conversation has moved far past policy disputes. It has become a question of organizational survival. That discussion is reserved exclusively for moments when the perceived risk of inaction becomes greater than the risk of intervention. What is happening is historically singular. We are seeing formal impeachment proceedings from the legislature overlapping with executive branch debates about the forcible replacement of the president. That isn't just noise, it is a full-scale constitutional stress test. It signals that confidence is not just flagging among the political opposition. It is fracturing within the chain of command. In markets, when every stakeholder, from the outside investor to the internal board, starts hedging against the CEO, you aren't looking at volatility. You are looking at leadership insolvency. That distinction is vital. It shifts the entire question from whether removal is probable to whether institutional survival now necessitates it. This juncture is unprecedented, not due to the novelty of political division, but because internal confidence appears to be completely unraveling. For senior members of an active administration to signal their disapproval, whether privately or publicly, signifies more than disagreement. It is a sign that fundamental operational trust has failed. You cannot effectively lead a nation or a corporation when internal alignment ceases to exist. Through all this static, one thing is obvious to me. Relying on surface-level media reports is increasingly insufficient. In business, we do not trade on headlines. We analyze fundamentals, motivations, and patterns of behavior. That same discipline must apply here. The critical data is not just what is being said, but who is saying it, why they are saying it now, and how it fits a larger pattern. We are observing signals, not just rumors, and prudent decision-makers must distinguish between the two. So let's focus on the specifics, because this is critical. These impeachment articles are not recycling past grievances. These are fresh allegations based on recent executive conduct that ignite new constitutional alarms. That distinction is paramount. When new precedents are being forged, the timeline is everything. Markets, political or financial, react most violently not to chaos, but to ambiguity about the actual rules of the game. That is our current location. In recent days, the shift has been dramatic, not only in the atmosphere, but in the gravity of the accusations. Certain lawmakers are now characterizing the president's latest actions as a form of hostile action against the United States itself. These are not colorful metaphors. The term being circulated is treasonous warfare. Legally, such terminology is exceptionally rare. From an investor's viewpoint, it signals that faith in executive self-control has shattered. When leadership is accused of working against its own nation, the discussion transcends politics. We are forced to measure the very integrity of the republic. Paired with this is a second accusation: a persistent and methodical violation of constitutional liberties. This isn't about one mistake. It's described as a deliberate and repeated pattern of exercising power beyond its legal confines. If substantiated, such a pattern has a ripple effect that goes far beyond the news cycle. In any organization, be it a company or a country, when the rules are persistently bent without repercussion, trust erodes. When trust disappears, stability follows. Legal experts are pointing to two specific catalysts that triggered these new articles. Let me explain them. The first was the September 22 executive order that aimed to label Antifa a domestic terrorist group. Regardless of your personal opinion of the group, the constitutional procedure for such a designation is clearly established. It involves specific legal thresholds, interagency validation, and congressional consultation. That entire established procedure was ignored. The concern here is not merely who was targeted, but how it was executed. There is an established statutory framework for identifying terrorist organizations. It involves congressional notification, multi-agency consensus, and adherence to specific legal thresholds. The president, in this instance, circumvented that entire structure with a unilateral executive order, which immediately raised concerns. However, the subsequent events were even more disturbing. Information then emerged that a federal prosecutor was potentially removed after refusing to initiate politically driven investigations against the president's adversaries. Now, in any system, when the tools of enforcement are repurposed for personal vendettas, we move past evaluating leadership and begin to question legitimacy. To be perfectly clear, this is not an issue of miscommunication or a simple policy dispute. If this allegation is true, it signifies that a public servant was terminated for upholding the law against political pressure, refusing to prosecute rivals without a sufficient legal basis. Legal scholars are already terming this a profound violation of constitutional norms. The issue isn't the single job, it's the precedent. If the Department of Justice can be subordinated to personal directives rather than the law, the rule of law itself is compromised. Once that accountability mechanism is broken, restoring trust is exponentially more difficult. According to various sources, a federal prosecutor was reportedly forced to resign for declining to pursue criminal charges against a high-profile state official. The implication was stark: fall in line or be ousted. That strategy might be presented as executive prerogative, but it more closely resembles coercion than governance. When a leader begins to purge their own appointees for failing to execute a political agenda, it is a sign of instability, not strength. In any boardroom, forcing out the voices of legal integrity would immediately trigger audits, mass resignations, and a shareholder revolt. In a government, the stakes are profoundly higher, because the shareholders are the citizenry. An emergency meeting was supposedly convened after the news spread that a top federal prosecutor faced termination. The justification? A refusal to target New York Attorney General Letitia James. This is alarming on its face. But the concurrent action is more telling. Concurrently with the impeachment progression in Congress, senior executive officials started private conversations, not about public relations, but about invoking the 25th Amendment. This signals something far deeper than disagreement. It suggests a comprehensive collapse of internal confidence. I need to explain the true function of this amendment. The 25th Amendment is a constitutional tool enabling the Vice President, backed by a cabinet majority, to formally state that the President is incapable of performing their duties. It was designed for operational stability, not political maneuvering. After January 6, this was not a theoretical exercise. Staff, family, and high-level advisors actively discussed methods to ensure institutional stability before the inauguration. That alone reveals how close the system came to failure. At that time, multiple cabinet members reportedly weighed invoking the clause. Several opted to resign instead. One senior figure took it further, proposing that the remaining cabinet should step in to collectively run the administration to mitigate the chaos. In corporate governance, this is the equivalent of the board seizing real-time operational control from a CEO. It is an action that is never taken unless the risk of inaction is judged to be catastrophic. In this context, the risk wasn't just to reputation. It was about preventing a systemic failure at the highest echelon of government. This campaign to hold President Trump accountable is not a new development. It has been building for years. Civil society organizations, legal experts, and various lawmakers have been methodically compiling documentation and legal arguments to address perceived constitutional breaches. But in statecraft, as in investing, timing is paramount. Democratic leadership has, until now, been cautious, not from timidity, but from strategic calculation. A poorly timed impeachment attempt is not merely ineffective, it can reshape the entire narrative, often strengthening the very individual it aims to constrain. History provides a clear lesson here. Trump survived 2 previous impeachments with his political influence intact, perhaps even bolstered. The Senate's failure to convict in both instances solidified the perception among his supporters that he was a victim of political theater, not legal accountability. That narrative, once established, is a formidable political asset. The perception of victimhood can be monetized into momentum. This is the precarious line Democrats must walk. The risk of validating the very conduct they seek to condemn. This explains why leadership has been awaiting a provocation so clear, so institutionally damaging, that even those across the aisle would be compelled to reevaluate their stance. The unilateral Antifa designation order appears to be that inflection point. While some may view the move as necessary action, others see it as a dangerous deviation from due process and a corrosion of legal norms. This goes beyond how things look. It's about executive power becoming untethered from the legal restraints designed to maintain a balance of power. In a constitutional framework, power is not absolute. Safeguards exist for a reason. The designation of a terrorist group, for instance, must follow a rigorous procedure managed by the State Department, substantiated by intelligence, and accountable to congressional review. It is not a discretionary tool. When a president bypasses this entire legal structure, the problem isn't just procedural, it's systemic. Leadership becomes erratic. And in finance, as in governance, unpredictability is the antidote to trust. These legal procedures are not bureaucratic hurdles. They are safeguards against tyranny. A terrorist designation is not just a headline. It unlocks powerful state mechanisms, asset freezes, enhanced surveillance authorizations, and special arrest provisions. These instruments are intended for national security, not for settling political scores. When such tools are deployed without meeting the statutory requirements, constitutional experts are not just worried, they are sounding an alarm, because if the system permits it once, it loses its ability to resist it the next time. Now, let's examine the parallel case of the federal prosecutor, where the situation becomes even more precarious. According to multiple independent reports, this prosecutor was allegedly directed to initiate investigations into individuals who were, concurrently, political opponents of the president. This is not a human resources issue. It is an issue of institutional impartiality. Prosecutors serve the law, not the political ambitions of an incumbent. If that boundary is breached, you don't just damage faith in the justice system. You risk transforming the law itself into a tool of leverage. That mutation, once it begins, is incredibly difficult to reverse. This shift is not a trivial matter. According to various independent reports, federal prosecutors may have been threatened with dismissal not for poor performance, but for their refusal to file charges that lacked a sound legal basis. In the private sector, terminating compliance officers for upholding the rules would prompt immediate regulatory investigations. In government, the consequences are far graver. It suggests that prosecutorial independence, a bedrock of our legal system, is being treated as a negotiable asset rather than a sacred function of the law. If these allegations are substantiated, and I must emphasize then we have exited the domain of politics and entered the territory of a severe ethical breach. The use of prosecutorial power to target rivals is not just improper, it severs the bond of trust between the citizen and the state. In authoritarian systems, the judiciary serves the ruler. In a constitutional republic, it must serve the law. Any departure from that principle inflicts long-term damage that cannot be healed by the next election. In conjunction with these developments, a separate federal action became news. A court issued an injunction, halting an attempt to furlough thousands of federal employees amidst the shutdown. The judge labeled the attempt politically charged and reckless, emphasizing the human impact of eliminating over 4,000 positions without proper justification. In investment analysis, this isn't a labor dispute. It's a governance risk. When short-term tactical maneuvers supersede long-term stability, value is destroyed, whether in a corporation or in public service. Decisions that disregard tangible human consequences invariably compound into wider systemic failures. Federal employee unions have voiced a significant concern that the layoffs targeted during the shutdown were a political calculation to pressure Congress, rather than an operational necessity. As the impasse stretches into its third week, the collateral damage is mounting. One organization, Free Speech for People, has been tracking executive conduct since the beginning of Trump's second term. Their most recent analysis catalogs 25 distinct grounds for impeachment. This number is not merely symbolic. It reflects an accumulating pattern of unchecked actions that, in aggregate, threaten the rule-based order of governance. Some items on that list are familiar. The handling of classified documents, financial conflicts of interest, and ethical lapses have been debated. What has changed is the recent addition of two new items in the last 48 hours. One related to the unilateral Antifa designation, the other to the removal of a federal prosecutor for political non-compliance. What differentiates this impeachment effort from previous ones isn't just the substance, it's the coalition forming around it. The momentum is no longer isolated to one party. It is being amplified by voices from across the legal and academic fields. This is not just a progressive-led initiative. Respected legal institutions, ex-federal prosecutors, and even some conservative constitutional experts are sounding the alarm. Their focus isn't on political optics. It's on legal precedent. When you see bipartisan consensus from experts that a boundary has been violated, the entire dynamic changes. This brings us back to the 25th Amendment, ratified in 1967. This provision was engineered to solve a specific problem. What happens if a president becomes incapable, physically, mentally or otherwise, of executing the duties of the office? It was constructed for continuity, not for political drama. Before its ratification, the U.S. had no mechanism to address presidential incapacitation, leaving the nation vulnerable to leadership vacuums. Section 4 of that amendment closed the gap. It permits the vice president, with the backing of a cabinet majority, to declare the president unfit to discharge the powers and duties of the office. It is, in effect, an emergency succession clause, built for moments of extreme institutional vulnerability. In such a case, the vice president immediately takes over as acting president. But here is what makes this clause so untested. It has never been deployed against a president who actively resists it. We have seen voluntary temporary transfers of power, such as during President Reagan's surgery, but never an involuntary, forced transition. The legal machinery is there. The constitutional option exists, but no one has ever deployed it against an unwilling incumbent. If it were to happen, it would not just be a first. It would become the new reference point for all future presidencies. According to reliable reports, high-level administration members are seriously evaluating this possibility. These are not marginal figures. They are individuals whose duties include protecting the continuity of the executive branch. When cabinet officials start designing a constitutional off-ramp for their own president, it signifies more than personal disagreement. It signals a deep structural fear. In corporate governance, when board members begin to explore the forced ouster of a CEO during a crisis, the company has already lost more than market confidence. It has lost its internal cohesion. The same principle is at play here. That discussion, the contemplation of the 25th Amendment, is no longer a hypothetical. It is a real-time calculation of institutional stability during the final high-pressure phase of a presidency. Over the last 48 hours, the internal anxiety within the executive branch has clearly escalated. But acting on that anxiety is costly for those involved. The political jeopardy is immense. In our current intensely polarized climate, a constitutionally sound action could be branded as treason. Once that label is applied, it turns public servants into pariahs, stripped of influence and exiled from future coalitions. The fact that senior officials are even entertaining this option is, therefore, revealing. It suggests they believe the standard checks on power are no longer functioning. We don't have the names, but reporting suggests the group reportedly involves legal and national security staff, people responsible for constitutional integrity and threat mitigation. If these individuals believe the system is failing, slipping beyond the reach of self-correction, then what we are seeing is not just panic. It is a signal that the fundamental brakes on power are perceived as non-functional. This is the type of internal breakdown that precedes an institutional intervention. This sudden haste is calculated. October 2025 is a rapidly closing window. With midterm elections under a year away, political calculations harden. Democratic leaders recognize that if they wait, the cost of inaction may be permanent. If Republicans regain control in the next election cycle, the opportunity for impeachment evaporates. It is a classic timing predicament, act now under intense pressure, or forfeit the ability to act at all. In finance, we call this opportunity cost. In government, it is often the precursor to paralysis. Momentum is rarely built on a single incident. It accumulates through a series of repeated signals. The Antifa designation and the prosecutor's removal are not separate incidents. They are viewed as data points in a larger pattern. Internally, decision-makers increasingly view these actions as part of a sequence, one that reflects a fundamental disdain for procedural boundaries. When an institution identifies recurring stress points that go uncorrected, sentiment shifts from caution to alarm. Political scholars will analyze this period for decades. The more immediate concern is the institutional response required before this pattern becomes an irreversible precedent. We are witnessing a clash between constitutional theory and political reality. And like any system under extreme pressure, the outcomes become harder to predict the longer the resolution is postponed. Should the House move forward with impeachment, the initial step is a formal vote. Given the current Democratic majority, that vote is procedurally feasible. But in governance, a vote is never just about the numbers. It's about the timing, the public perception, and the ultimate consequences. Every institutional action now sends a message, not just to the electorate, but to all future administrations, about what the system will tolerate versus what it will challenge. This is where the path narrows. A House impeachment vote is only the beginning. The matter then moves to the Senate, where a conviction requires a supermajority of 2/3. That threshold is not just a number, it is a cultural bar, demanding bipartisan consensus on where constitutional lines are drawn. It's critical to note that neither impeachment nor the 25th Amendment by itself bars a president from running for office again. Only if the Senate first convicts and then holds a subsequent vote by a simple majority can such a ban on holding future office be implemented. In corporate parallels, this is the board not only firing the CEO, but also passing a motion to prevent their future rehiring. The stakes are about legacy, not just immediate legality. At that stage, following a Senate conviction, a mere 51 votes would be sufficient to block the former president from ever holding federal office. But this process is about more than eligibility. It is about historical positioning. Every impeachment sets a documented precedent, a permanent record that informs how future generations will judge leadership. In capital markets, reputational harm can outlast operational losses by decades. The same holds true in politics. A legacy defined by repeated impeachments becomes a permanent liability, not just for the person, but for the institutions that were complicit. If this advances, Trump will be the only president in American history to have 3 separate impeachment proceedings against him. That fact alone has immense symbolic weight. But there is also the media component. The ensuing weeks or months of televised hearings would compel legislators to take a public stand on these allegations. For Republicans, it would mean defending their alignment with Trump under intense public scrutiny. For the nation, it could be an inflection point. Public opinion is not just molded by facts, it is molded by the prolonged, collective processing of those facts. This exposure shapes public opinion, and public opinion ultimately sways elections. Even if it falls short of removal, the residual impact could be significant. It might cripple the administration's capacity to govern, negotiate, or advance policy. It would also permanently reframe how historians and legal scholars interpret this period. The 25th Amendment, by contrast, remains a separate and distinct lever. Unlike impeachment, which is a methodical, multi-week process, the 25th can transfer authority almost instantly. It is built for speed in a crisis. And when institutions are confronting escalating uncertainty, the velocity of the resolution is a critical variable for stability. If the 25th Amendment were invoked, the vice president would immediately become the acting president. The legal design of this process transfers authority first and handles disputes second. Even if Trump challenged the declaration, he would remain powerless while Congress adjudicated the conflict. Reclaiming his authority would necessitate majority approval from both the House and the Senate. Unlike impeachment, which starts in the House, this reversal is a high bar, requiring bicameral support. It is the governmental equivalent of a hostile takeover, where the shareholders are the institutions themselves. In theory, the 25th provides a cleaner, faster resolution than impeachment. But it has one critical dependency. The vice president must initiate or consent to the action. Without that individual's participation, the entire mechanism is inert. This makes it a question of leadership as much as a question of law. If the second-in-command refuses to act, the cabinet is powerless. This dependency was intentionally designed to prevent a reactionary coup. It also means that even if a cabinet consensus exists, action requires centralized courage. But this carries a more profound danger, and it's essential to understand this. If the 25th Amendment is ever deployed not for its intended purpose of incapacity, but as a political weapon, it establishes an irreversible and dangerous precedent. Imagine a future where sharp policy differences become grounds for a removal campaign. That is not institutional balance. It is executive instability masked as governance. The distinction between necessary intervention and political opportunism must be preserved. Once that line is blurred, it undermines not just the current presidency, but the structural credibility that all future presidencies depend on. We call that reputational contagion in my field. In a democracy, it is the mechanism of delegitimization. If one administration misuses constitutional safeguards as tactical tools, it greenlights the next administration to do the same. What was designed as a final safeguard becomes just another political option. That is not constitutional order. It is strategic erosion. Every subsequent president would govern under the threat of internal ouster, not just public disapproval. It fundamentally shifts the balance of power inward, creating endemic instability. From my vantage point, this is not only dangerous, it is expensive. Uncertainty always carries a cost. If this advances, the fallout will be significant, public, and defining. The House is likely to move forward, and the resulting media coverage will be overwhelming. If impeachment articles pass the House, Trump becomes the only president in American history to be impeached 3 times. That alone is historically significant. The Senate, however, is the true barrier. The effort will almost certainly die there. Republicans will frame it as a partisan attack and an attempt to nullify an election. Democrats, in contrast, will argue it is about accountability and the defense of democratic norms. But as with all hyper-polarizing events in our time, the narrative will shatter. Each side will energize its base, and the wider public will be left to navigate the ambiguity. The nation's existing divisions will likely deepen. Public opinion will not move decisively. As for the 25th Amendment, it will likely recede from discussion. The political price is simply too high, and the legal precedent too untested. Cabinet secretaries will calculate the personal risk to their reputations and careers, and most will determine that action is not survivable. In capital markets, this is reputational risk aversion. In politics, it manifests as a kind of strategic paralysis, where everyone can see the approaching danger, but no one is willing to be the first to step out of the way. The very fact that these conversations are occurring, in the halls of power, in the media, and in our homes, is itself a critical signal. It means that decision-makers, including those within the administration, have concluded that the current situation is untenable. In my experience, when insiders begin to voice alarm, it is rarely ideological. It stems from a structural discomfort with risk. In this instance, a risk that is not financial, but institutional. That fact should trouble every American, whether you track politics obsessively or try to avoid it. Systemic failure does not begin with a sudden collapse. It begins with silence, which then hardens into normalization. This is, fundamentally, a test of our entire constitutional architecture. Will the institutional guardrails hold when subjected to actual intense pressure? Not in theory, but in practice. Does the legislative branch still serve as a genuine check on power, or has partisanship neutered its resolve? Do cabinet officials serve as fiduciaries of the republic, or merely as loyalists to an individual? I have always maintained that pressure reveals character. This is also true of institutions. We are poised to learn if checks and balances, is a functional reality or merely a phrase in a history book. This is not just a political spectacle. It is a stress test of the American experiment. The outcome will resonate far beyond this single presidency. If accountability is avoided now, we establish a new standard that future leaders of all parties will study, and not for the right reasons. When the abuse of power has no associated cost, the entire incentive structure of our democracy breaks. However, if this episode results in genuine, measured consequences, it could reaffirm the principle that no individual, not even the president, is above the system. In the long term, that is the signal that markets, citizens, and democracies require to restore faith. When institutions begin to flex their constitutional muscles, it sends a message through the entire system, to lawmakers, to businesses, and to everyday Americans. If impeachment degrades into just another partisan procedure, detached from principle, it loses the very deterrent power that is meant to safeguard the republic. Accountability is not about settling today's score. It is about ensuring the long-term viability of a system built on trust. If leaders, whether in the cabinet or among the electorate, choose silence, the repercussions will not just be political, they will be cultural. And as any investor knows, culture will always devour strategy. This situation is dynamic. We may see more individuals inside the administration choose to speak out, driven either by conscience or by self-preservation. New documents may appear. Timelines may change. Even party loyalty has its breaking point when reputational risk becomes existential. Sometimes the price of silence exceeds the price of dissent. But we must also be realistic. There is a significant possibility that the entire apparatus stalls, and in doing so, it rewards the defiance. This is the paradox of political inertia. It often strengthens the very thing it fails to address. What matters is not just who prevails in the moment, but whether the nation derives any learning from the experience. Whatever happens, this will be a case study for generations about leadership, institutional fortitude, and the democratic response to internal stress. These are not merely volatile times. They are definitive ones. History tends to assign immense weight to the decisions made in such moments. We are not just observing this story. We are all participants. Whether we are managing capital, running a business, or raising a family, the integrity of our democratic framework dictates the environment for all of us. That is why this matters. That is why I am paying such close attention. The immediate future rests on a delicate balance of political will and constitutional obligation. While the House may have the votes to move the articles forward, the real conflict will be fought in the court of public opinion and in the quiet hallways where loyalty is tested. The allegations are no longer about one incident, but about a cumulative pattern of conduct that defies the very mechanisms of oversight. This is not simply a political crisis. It is a diagnostic test of the republic's immune system. The question is whether our democratic antibodies, oversight, legal consequence, and institutional resistance are strong enough to overcome a sustained assault on their authority. The simultaneous discussion of impeachment and the 25th Amendment shows a system frantically checking every tool in its box. This multi-front response confirms the perceived severity of the threat. It is the sign of a constitution that is alive, but it is also a sign of one that is under profound distress. The markets have always known that uncertainty is the greatest foe of investment. Likewise, in governance, ambiguity about the rules of engagement destroys the foundational trust a stable nation requires. The coming days will be an education in real-time political risk. Watch not just the public declarations and votes, but the resignations, the anonymous leaks from inside, and the subtle changes in terminology from key institutional figures. Those are the leading indicators of systemic shifts. The burden of history is now on a very small number of people: lawmakers, cabinet secretaries, and senior advisors. They must determine if their ultimate allegiance is to a person or to the office and the constitutional order. Their decisions, made under intense pressure, will become part of the permanent record, defining the template for managing future crises of legitimacy. The cost of acting is high, but the cost of inaction, the normalization of this behavior and the precedent it would create, may be catastrophically higher, potentially reshaping the very nature of the American presidency for generations. This is not about one individual. It is about the system that must outlast him. It is about whether we, as a nation, still subscribe to the safeguards our founders established, or whether we have decided those safeguards are optional when they are politically inconvenient. In my investing career, I have always said that the most vital quality is temperament, not intellect. The same is true for a democracy. Do we possess the national temperament to enforce accountability when it is difficult, when it is unpopular, and when it divides us? That is the examination. And we are all being graded. Listen, in my 94 years, I have weathered significant political storms. I have seen crises that felt apocalyptic. I have watched the system bend and crack. But in the end, it held. This instance strikes me as unique. It is not because the dangers are novel, but because the very mechanisms designed to contain them are being stressed in unprecedented ways. What we do now, what our leaders do, will not just define this presidency. It will define the office of the presidency itself for decades. That is a profound burden, but it is also a sacred duty. We are custodians of these institutions, not their owners. We are meant to protect them and pass them on. If we fail in that duty, the cost will not be political. It will be generational. So remain vigilant. Stay informed. And do not forget, in any system, indifference is an action. And often, it is the one with the highest long-term cost. Thank you for your time.